Today, we're going to dive into heart rate variability at a depth that we may have not before, because we have a special guest today, Dr. Marco Altini. I have a quick favor to ask before we start. I'm not even asking 30 seconds of your time. If you have been enjoying the 90% Healthy podcast, we truly appreciate if you hit subscribe. It genuinely helps us grow and reach more people and keep bringing you thoughtful conversations about health that actually moves the needle without losing your mind. We're really, really grateful that you're here and continue to be. Now let's jump in the episode. Welcome back to the 90% Healthy podcast. I'm your co-host, Klaudia Balogh, and I've got Don here. Hi, Don.
Hey, Klaudia.
All right, today we're going to dive into heart rate variability at a depth that we may have not before, because we have a special guest today, Dr. Marco Altini, who holds a PhD cum laude and in applied machine learning, M.Sc in computer science engineering, and just so much depth in what HRV is for you as an individual, whether you're in longevity medicine, whether you're an elite performer, whether you're just a weekend warrior. There is a gap that Don and we've seen for years now, that there is HRV and it tells you something, but what you're doing with it, there's a disconnect. So, Marco Altini, you've spent your career living in that gap and really being able to share with the world how to apply HRV in various scenarios. A lot has to do within training. I mean, you co-founded HRV for Training. You're an advisor for Oura. You released your first book, Heart Rate Variability, Science and Strategies for Peak Performance. So we're very, very excited to have you on. I mean, I consider you a world's expert in HRV today. So let's dive into the conversation. And thanks so much for coming on from Italy.
Yeah,
thank you so much.
Dr. Altini, you have a remarkable intersection in the backgrounds of machine learning, computer science, human movement. How did all these come together in your focus on HRV?
Yeah, I would say almost by chance, right? I didn't have a plan to get into this. I studied first the technology side of things and computer science and engineering. And what I found really piqued my interest was how we could use those skills to measure things through technology on the body, and then try to see, how the body would respond to the things that we do, from physical activity to the stresses that we face and so on, in different ways, right? And I was fortunate to end up in a research institute where they were developing basically prototypes of what now we call wearables. So we would have all these sensors to measure the activity of the heart, the activity of our muscles, and the activity of the brain, and also to things, and how that would relate to different behaviors and different aspects of health and performance. And so that's when I got more interested into these technologies. So maybe heart rate variability was the one that was, in a way, I felt like the technology was ready. Right? I don't think we are at the same stage when we look at the activity of the brain, for example, but in terms of measuring the activity of the heart and our stress response, it's something that was established in the literature for many years. And now the technology was just more user-friendly. So it was time we could bring that to people so that they could actually start measuring these things in a way that is a bit more helpful, which is not just measuring it once, maybe after before and after a specific stressor or situation, like it was done a bit in the medical literature, but measuring it every day because the technology is so easy to use and you can wear it, or you can just use an app or anything like that. So that's a bit how it developed, first looking at the technology and what we could do with it. And then I got really interested into these aspects, especially in their relationship with post-performance. And so I went back to university and also studied sports science and tried to, bring together these two words, so the applied use of the technology and the development of the technology in a way that, people can actually make sense of the data and use it in a way that helps us.
Could you recall, do you have a memory of your aha moment when HRV really became this central thread of your career?
Yeah, well, I was, I think during my PhD at that point, I was doing some work with these wearable sensors. And on the side, I was looking in particular at HRV apply to myself at that stage. So, I was, let's say, stressed by work mostly, right? And I was also a recreational athlete. But for me, the main stressor was always work, because that's where I had to perform more than, exercise, which was actually something that maybe would help me manage stress, right? Because it was not what would allow me, to eat, right? So my profession was really the stressor in my life. And then looking at the data and having the technology ready to, start developing tools and apps that allow you to capture that, I felt like this was something that was potentially very useful, because it could capture, well, measured again at the right time, something we can discuss later, our stress response in a way that was not something that was out there for people to use at that time. And so it was maybe 12, 13 years ago already at this point, right? And then the technology was ready because we had the first iPhones that could also talk to all our straps. And that seems like obvious, but at that time, well, first, you didn't have smartphones like 15 to 20 years ago, so you couldn't develop an app to do certain kind of thing. And then when you had the first smartphones, you couldn't link it to external sensors because the protocols to communicate between these devices were not there. So at that time, I was just, I guess, fortunate that when I got interested in these kind of things, the technology was there, the protocols had been developed, the sensors were there. And so I started building these apps and tools that could measure these quantities. And at the beginning, it was very experimental. And for me, it was a side project. And, I was building these things and people started using it. And I saw there was a growing interest in these kind of things beside my own. And then I just basically kept developing the tools. And eventually it became what I decided to do, basically, with the following 10 years of my life, working on building these tools and interpreting the data, and trying to communicate also the science in a way that people can find it, effective for them.
Marco, your stated goal is to stay between the hype and skepticism. And in the world of wearables and the biometrics today, where do you see the most dangerous hype in this space?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think some of the issues I see come from the fact that originally we set out to try to measure some things from the body that could be useful. And then along the way, we kind of stopped doing that. If you look at what most wearables are measuring today, they're measuring the exact same thing that we were measuring 10, 15 years ago. And everything else is estimated from parameters that are somewhat linked to what we'd like to measure, but we are not measuring. For example, we have, a wearable that might be on the finger or on the wrist or wherever, and it's simply measuring basically changes in blood volume with the optical sensor that gives us heart rate and heart rate variability. And we could say that is measured, but then from that, we derive all sorts of things that we cannot really measure with that device, right? It's going to be sleep stages, it's going to be our readiness or recovery or our biological age, all sorts of things that are eventually made up from parameters that are somewhat linked to what we'd like to look at while we are not looking at those things. So on my end, I would have liked trajectory in which wearables maybe were going to add more hardware, sensors that could measure other things on our body, as opposed to maintaining those same sensors that we had 10, 15 years ago, and then basically trying to make up a lot of other things in software in a way that eventually I think is not serving us so well.
That's a great observation. I call it the real numbers versus the fake numbers. And it winds up being challenging because so many people get these devices and they get buried in, but we'll talk more about that as we go. Klaudia, you had a question?
Yeah, I was wondering, I would like you, we have people on the podcast and experts who work with HRV, and we like hearing their definition of it. So I would love to kind of see what your definition is, and also kind of from that pivot into why did you now decide to have a book published. Even, you had over 50 papers under your belt and patents, and why book now?
Yeah, all right. So in terms of what's HRV, for me is a proxy of our stress response. And I would say also of our capacity to assimilate additional stress on a given day. So if we go, at a physiological or technical point of view, what we are looking at, of course, is the variability between consecutive heartbeats, and we measure that variation, which is not random, but is due to how the nervous system is responding to stress. But then, in simple terms, I would say also in practical terms, the way I see it is just an indirect proxy of stress, because we cannot measure, stress, this somewhat abstract entity, and we cannot even measure our nervous system, but the nervous system impacts heart rhythm. So I think most people are familiar with the feeling they have when they feel stressed, and maybe they feel their heart a bit racing. So your heart rate gets a bit higher. And, in similar ways, heart rate variability has also a change when we feel stressed or when we are stressed. That is not something we can really sense, right? This heart rate is one thing. Maybe we feel like our heart is racing and things like that. But the variability is something we need to compute with different methods. And in the situation in which we are under stress, typically it goes the opposite way of heart rate. So it is reduced instead of increased. And the reason why we go through the trouble of looking at that as opposed to just heart rate is that it tends to be a bit more sensitive to stress. So if we have a very strong stressor, like we're getting sick, typically heart rate is good enough. It will show that there is a strong change in our physiology. But if the stressor is a bit more subtle, maybe we are slowly getting a bit more stress at work, or our training load is a bit higher. Things that don't show up yet in our heart rate could already start showing in our heart rate variability. And as such, it's a signal that we can use maybe a bit more proactively to make some small changes and try to keep things in balance before, the stressor becomes something chronically negative. And in terms of the book, I would say, there's a field that it captured me because there was a strong, background in terms of how long it has been used. And it was, there was a lot of literature in the medical literature about heart rate variability. So there was a strong physiological basis. But at the same time, it was so not obvious. How do we interpret the data? When should we measure it? How do we use it? And so it always remained, I would say, intellectually stimulating to try to figure out these kind of things. And I kept learning for all this time. So 10, 15 years, I never felt like I understood things exactly how they work, and there was always something to learn, and there's still something to learn. But maybe now, together with my co-authors, we felt like we had a good knowledge of different aspects of human physiology in the context of heart rate variability to try to put together something that could be a good resource for people that want to learn on this topic.
How long did it take for you guys to write it? Just to follow up.
So, well, originally I met with Dan Pius. It was probably at the beginning of COVID, so 2020 or something like that. And we started writing some chapters. But then we really sped up when we involved also Sylvain Laborde and Emma Mosley, and that was maybe 2 years ago, 2.5. So, yeah, I would say it's been working, 4 of us on it, maybe 2.5 years, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Good work this
Well,
time.
as a former
Thanks.
professor, I'll tell you the academic environment needed this book. As you know, I've been teaching HRV. I've been teaching HRV in the classroom since back in 2010, 2015. And you're having to piece together different pieces out there. So it's an excellent addition to the literature. So thank you. I have a question about this now. I think you talked about this in your newsletter, and I think I saw it in the book. And we were talking about what we call parasympathetic lock, and that is that when we train. So and just to put this in perspective, Marco, I think you've done the majority of your work in distance training. You're an ultra marathoner. Those are the kind of I'm a former wrestler, and work with wrestling and do a lot of work. So we cover both ends of the physiological spectrum when we're doing this. And HRV has been a beneficial variable for both of us. And I see parasympathetic lock with my elite wrestlers. I see a very low resting heart rate, a very, very high RMSSD. And when I see those together, I start to get concerned. I feel like I need to bring in a non-work-based sympathetic stimulus. Now, we'll use cold water or things like that. Is that the same kind of a relationship that you see in your distance people?
Yeah, I think that can happen in a number of situations, and it's one of the things that typically is not interpreted correctly, right? Because the signals you mentioned, typically people would associate them to a positive change, right? A reduction in heart rate and increased heart rate variability. But I think maybe there is some confusion between what is our long-term, let's call it chronic goal in this, in a change in our physiology, and what happens acutely, maybe because of some major stressor. And what happens acutely on a day-to-day basis, if we have that type of response, typically means that something did not go so well, meaning that the parasympathetic system is basically not showing that you're very recovered, but that you're maybe very busy recovering or working on some stressor that you faced. Because even outside of exercise, I've seen data from people that maybe had an accident and then they were at the hospital, and those kind of situations where you would expect HRV to be very low and heart rate to be very high, but you had the exact opposite signal, a bit like you said. So in those situations, I think typically if you have an abnormally high heart rate variability and low heart rate with respect to what's the individual historical
almost
data.
Almost an atrial fib response.
Yeah, but in this case, with even with a regular sinus rhythm, so I think that is also important for people to know that the data might be good, and there might be no heart rhythm abnormality, but still you have this kind of response, and we cannot interpret basically in such a simplistic way heart rate variability as it is often done in the context of higher is better, but not really. So maybe chronically we want to get things stable or slightly higher, even though that is also something that I would challenge at times, because there is also changes that are due to seasonality in our physiology. So if I start some healthy habits and it's September and I live in the Northern Hemisphere and I'm approaching winter, and then maybe my HRV stays where it is or it goes even a bit down. And it's not because of my new, good, positive, healthy habits. It's because there's other factors. There's less daylights, the days are shorter, like different temperature. All sort of things impact our physiology. So I think we cannot just use this metric as this simplistic outcome measure as some people try to use it. Yeah.
Do you, when it comes to that, do you go to secondary readings? Now, one of the things that I do is that when I like to have that RMSSD measurement. That's kind of my 10,000 foot measurement. But when I'm wanting to diagnose more, I tend to drop down into LFHF measurements. Do you find yourself doing that, or do you stay away from those?
I would say that it depends a bit on the measurement protocol, because for practical reasons, I think a lot of the data now is collected over very short time frames. And then if we want to look at the frequencies, for sure, for the low frequencies, we need to collect at least 5 minutes of data. And most of the people I work with would take, a shorter snapshot, typically a minute. So certain kind of things we cannot really look at them. And typically,
Sure.
I will look at HRV, and then I would look simply at resting heart rate, and then, of course, integrate the subjectively how they feel and talk to them, right? Because I think that's a good part of coaching is, the having that kind of conversations and trying to understand, basically to add as much context as possible around the data so that we can make the correct interpretation.
I love
And
that.
we're not quite there yet, are we?
Yeah, I know, to automate everything, for sure not. So, despite AI, we still need to get some more context and talk to the person. Yeah.
Yeah, and I feel like HRV has been in the spotlight, especially in athletics, for a pretty long time, for up to a decade at least. But I keep seeing in conversations or online and these platforms that a lot of the same myths keep coming up. Like, do you notice these trends of patterns where you keep having to debunk and clarify among serious athletes and coaches things that they believe about HRV, but you keep having to reiterate this isn't correct?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's for everyone, people that have, work in performance, or people that use HRV outside of those contexts, or people that also are at different, levels. It doesn't mean that if you work in an elite performance environment, those things are sorted out. I think the same doubts sometimes remain. Again, the higher is better is really a common one. It's it's something we focus on a lot, to help people understand that HRV, just like many other physiological signals, typically a good response is a stable response. And I think it helps to look at it just like we look at other signals. You can think of blood glucose or blood pressure. We know that, there is this optimal range where we want to be, and, you go too high or too low, and it's not particularly good. And I think we can think of HRV a bit like that as well. So if things remain stable, since we measure it at a certain time, it could be the morning or it could be the night, typically. So we have, those 24 hours to bounce back from stressors, and being stable does not mean that we don't face stressors. Of course, we want to face stressors. That's how we grow. But at the same time, the body needs to bounce back within a reasonable time, within your normal, and, keep that stability, because if it doesn't, then it means that we did not have the capacity at that point to deal with that stressor. And that can become chronically an issue, right? It could lead to burnout professionally, it could lead to overtraining for an athlete. So we want to keep the stability and bounce, apply the stressor and bounce back from the stressor. And that's why we try, to introduce things like the normal range for an individual. And the challenge there is typically that for these other signals I mentioned, like blood pressure and blood glucose, there is a normal range that is sort of population derived, while for HRV, it does not exist. So if you measure it once, you basically don't learn anything. You need to measure it, several days and weeks to understand what is your own normal range, because a lot of it is genetically established, basically. So if, your friend has RMSSD, which is the typical HRV metric, that is 150, and yours is 40, and you're a healthy person, I would say it's basically impossible for you to get to 150, right? And that is totally fine. It doesn't mean anything negative. But to interpret the data, you need to establish that your own normal range, where, basically is going to be around that 40. And some days you will be below that. And that typically means that there's been maybe a negative stress response. And it's a good time maybe to focus on some strategies to aid recovery or things like that, so that you can get back to your normal.
Yeah,
That's
I love that. When I first heard you talk about this normal that you want it stable as opposed to constantly wanting higher and higher, higher, that was so nice to hear, because I was that person who's like, why is my brother's HRV 120 and I can never get up to 60 because I'm always in the high 30s? And then when I had that interview with you, and you literally made it so clear that it is stability over continuous increase what you really want. That was
Yeah.
this massive aha moment where I became really good friends with my HRV.
I'm glad.
Yeah.
so in your newsletter, Marco, you covered what you called 1,000 days of tracking your own HRV, with a focus on measurement duration and protocols. Tell me about what you learned in that process.
Right. So this piece was actually the data of, I would say, a colleague, basically a student of HRV that I worked with for a long time, because he was using some of our tools. So we exchanged a lot of interactions, and he got really interested into the different protocols, the morning data, the night data, how the data reflects stressors, especially outside of training. So that's also why I think it's quite interesting, because HRV is applied a lot in performance context, and when it comes to sports and training, and it makes sense because, of course, in that context, you have control over the stressor. So it's easy to close the loop because you have your stress response from HRV, and then if something is off, you can adjust your training. So if you're stressed because you have issues at work or with family or with other major stressor, you cannot do it so simply, right? If at work you have issues, you cannot just say, okay, today I don't have those issues. Like you would do with training, you have a high intensity sessions and you just say, okay, I don't do the high intensity session because it's not good for my body today. For training, it's an easy application. Outside of training, not so much. And I mean, the student, I think during this period, I think he's from Iran. So he was also back in his country in periods in which, the war started. And you could really see like stressful situations, and also his health at that point was not great. And you could really capture all of these dynamics, as well as I think he was still a PhD student at that time. So you could also see maybe more stressful periods associated to, his profession. And all of these things show up quite well in the data. And I think it was interesting to see also that the morning data, it was more sensitive to all of these stressors with respect to the night data. It's something I tried to stress a few times, also with the work that we do, because obviously the night data is very convenient, right? You can collect it passively. You don't have to do anything. So I think it's great that you can get that insight, and it's very informative. At the same time, there are some limitations. And one in particular is that, of course, you are measuring as you sleep and you are lying down, while when you measure intentionally in the morning, you could measure while sitting up. And this simple action of sitting up, which we call technically the orthostatic stressor, it just basically means that you change body position and your body needs to readjust a few things, even just blood pressure and so on, so that even if you stand up, you don't faint. And that little stressor and the adjustments that follow make it so that if you measure your physiology shortly after, the measurement is more sensitive to stress. So basically the response is amplified. And you can see this very easily in certain situations. For example, maybe you're a bit sick or you're getting sick, and your heart rate, even just looking at heart rate, a simpler parameter, in the night might be the same as the previous night, or maybe 1 or 2 beats higher. So it's difficult to tell if something is going on. And then if you sit up in the morning, it's like 10 beats higher than your normal when you sit up. Like it just amplified the response because the body is challenged. And then since it's not well, it struggles basically to readjust as quickly as it would normally do. So that type of protocol, I think, is more effective, even though, of course, it requires that you intentionally measure your HRV in the morning, which is not something that everybody finds, practical.
No, it's challenging. And when I first started looking at HRV, God, it's been 30 years ago. I was working for Polar, the heart rate monitor company, and they were just introducing some of these heart rate variability features. That was one of them. And when you have someone that's very dedicated, I could get a good athlete to do that process. I couldn't get some of my athletes to do it. It just getting the commitment to that was hard. So having the nighttime resting measurement was relatively easy for most of those people, but you got to pay attention to the fact that you may be missing something there. When would you consider nighttime resting measurements from wearables not enough? When do you consider it good enough, and when do you consider it not enough?
I would say that for general health, they are a good proxy to what's happening. For example, when you're getting sick, typically you start seeing changes in your night data. If you face very big stressors, if you travel or like all sort of things, alcohol intake, diet changes, these kind of things show up quite well, especially I would say there's also this component of, the night, of course, comes before the morning. So in a way, it is more linked to what happens earlier. So your behavior shows up a bit more in night data, while in morning data, after the restorative effect of sleep, I think you see more your capacity to handle stress on that given day. So for an athlete,
Interesting.
that might, because of simply, of time passing, right? You give more time to the body to get back to normal. So in the morning, you might see less the effect of behavior if behavior was not that detrimental. And then you see better what you can basically assimilate on that day. And so for a good athlete, maybe I would think that a morning measurement is better. While for general health and for general population, where maybe you are more linked to they're more interested to seeing what is the link between your behavior and your stress response, then it could actually be more informative to get your night data possibly through a web. Also because I think that if as an athlete you're pushing your limits and you're always training a lot, but some periods you push your limit a bit more, it could be that then the morning protocol allows you to capture potential changes there, something that maybe does not look the way you'd like it to look. While in the night, you might not be able to see that just because, again, it's this highly parasympathetic state and you're sleeping and so on. So I think it depends a bit also on the application of interest and what you want to see. What is the behavior of the person? Like if a person has a behavior that is, let's say, let's say my own behavior, I would call it boring. It's like every day is pretty much the same, Monday to Sunday. And then, dinner is early and I don't drink alcohol and I go to bed early and these kind of things. So if that is the profile, then night and morning data are actually quite similar because there are not big stresses in the evening to impact night data differently. So in certain situations, they can also be more similar. While if your behavior in the evening, there's more to it, then it could be that you see that more reflected in night data and the morning data is quite different. So it depends a bit, again, on the person, on the profile, on the interest, and on their behavior as well.
You're a single guy, aren't you, Marco?
I am married.
Oh, you are?
Yes,
very
you're
good.
married,
Okay. Kids?
No, I don't have kids, though.
Okay. Because I find that's a major lifestyle change that tends to disrupt many of those morning processes.
Yeah. Actually, having done this for a while in terms of supporting clients and customers that have been using HRV for training for many years, that is the number one reason not to use morning measurement. I think everybody says the same. It's like I got kids, I just cannot do this anymore.
Yeah.
I'm curious. So there's one thing to look at HRV as a proxy and it becomes a feedback loop to what your behavior is the night before and then how it impacts your overnight recovery. But I'm seeing, and I'm sure you are too, a massive trend in these wearables starting to point to like you will need to look at trends over time. Now, when do you think that is useful and when do you think it becomes too much noise for the user and gives them more anxiety?
Yeah, it's a great point. So I think that we tend to always give a bit too much weight to today's data, what just happened, the acute change, as opposed to what is happening in the medium long term on the trend. That's how the tools work, right? You measure and they will show you your score today and they will sort of judge it, right? It's good or it's not good. And, they will give you advice based on what it is. So I think we tend to be overly reactive on this data typically, even though the science has actually been going in the other direction, meaning that in the past, also when you wanted to guide training using HRV, and I go back to training just because it's a simple application, like we said before, it's just, okay, HRV is low, you reduce training intensity, right? So we just keep it that simple. And in the past, you would do that based on the score of today, while in the past, I would say at this point, 10 years, the research has been looking at your trend mostly. So if your recent data is still within your normal, then we just keep going. We are not so reactive to the daily score. If it is low today, maybe it's nothing and tomorrow is back to normal. You don't need to change everything today just because maybe your sleep was a bit worse or any other reason that caused a drop. Now, I think real life is a bit more complicated than that, than a simple research studies, because sometimes, you have a drop and you cannot just, because maybe you are getting sick or you are sick, and then you cannot say, okay, I just keep going for 4 days because my trend will also be bad. It's like you just need to intervene at that point, something is wrong. So in central situations, I think, yes, we want to be less reactive and want to look more at the bigger picture. But we also need to pay attention a bit to acute changes. And in particular, I think often we just need to be honest with ourselves also as people that develop these technologies, that in many situations make assumptions or try to give answers that we don't have. Like sometimes we just have to combine that data with how you feel subjectively or all these sort of things that we discussed also earlier. And only in that way you can really basically also eventually make sense of the data, so it cannot be fully automated. And that, I think that remains an important point, even if we look at the trends and the bigger picture or the daily variation.
And then
I
go for it.
think that we deal with data obsession from time to time. And something that I tell people is that you can't wake up in the morning and look at your numbers and decide what you're going to do that day. That it's
Yeah.
critical that you get a goal out on the horizon. You get that goal out there, you put a plan towards achieving that goal. And that goal can be anything. It can be a sporting event, but it can be a wedding, it can be a vacation, it can be something. I call them trainable life events. An event that if I show up for it and I'm in better shape, I'll enjoy it more. And I think that's what's so critical. And now when I start to see my program deviate from my goal, then I'll start to adjust my program, but I don't do it on a day-to-day basis. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, for sure. And I use these tools with the people I personally coach, but we're not adjusting things every day or making so many changes. It's about small adjustments. It's about trying to capture the bigger picture, how they are responding to everything that is happening in their life, that is training and everything else that they are doing. And then sometimes there will be a situation in which they feel like things are not going where they should go, and the data backs that up. And those are moments in which we think, okay, let's change something, right? Because you're not feeling great, maybe that you're aware of certain stressor that is happening in your life, and we can see that also in the data. And so all these things point in that direction, and so it's a good time to make a change. But we cannot wake up and look at a number and then decide that we're going to change everything every day just based on that number.
Thank
Right.
goodness. I love that. And speaking of things that move the needle, I want to talk a little bit about, based on your experience, what have you seen that really moves this number more than something else? Like, is it sleep, nutrition, hydration? Is it emotional stress? Like, what are you seeing that if somebody wants to really like hone in on optimizing their HRV and perhaps their training based on that, like what are some of the first things that they need to really get solid before they do the next thing?
Yeah, for sure. Many of what you mentioned, I would say from the research, we know that for people that are inactive, being active helps a lot. So, and that, doesn't mean that you need to become a professional athlete, right? Meeting the basic guidelines, 30 minutes, few days per week is already a lot better than not doing that, right? So we all know that when you get, when you basically make the first step towards something, you already basically get most of the change that you would get if you keep, increasing your dose until you are basically an outlier on the other end, which at that point could actually be counterproductive. So physical activity for sure, sleep for sure. And with sleep, I would say also highly individual, right? It's not that you need necessarily to get X hours, but, I think people are quite aware of what is the sleep that they need, if they are sleep deprived or not. So it could be different for different people. For sure, it's an important factor. Our diet, of course, as well. So I would say the typical, big factors behind most health-related parameters are these ones, and the ones that we can see have an impact also on our physiology. And then you mentioned, stress as emotional stress. And those things are for sure key. I think we are just less good at capturing them. So if sometimes we don't have, strong evidence in favor of something just because we don't have a good way to look at it. Because we all know that, if we are chronically stressed because of a difficult family situation or a difficult work situation, or, our environment is not helping us, maybe we are, growing up in a difficult environment, all of those things have a huge impact, on our physiology, on our stress response, and our resting physiology, as in HRV. Those things, often are also much harder to change, but for sure key. And, there's always someone that eats well and exercises a lot, and then you ask them, but what do you do? And they are, of course they are a CEO of X companies and have been working like 1,000,000 hours for 30 years, and they wonder why there's a sign of that maybe in their physiology. So obviously all of
Or
these
they're
things matter.
orthopedic surgeons, or they're orthopedic surgeons, or they're emergency room for surgeons. They're people that have a lot of things in their lives that disrupt their ability to recover, for lack of a better term.
Yeah. And so all of that, I think, matters. And sometimes we can capture some of these things and we can say that, okay, it's likely that picking up exercises improves your HRV. Sometimes we cannot really capture well these things, but I think we know quite well that, stress from different sources will have an impact.
So when we start talking about the recovery side of this, or the intentional recovery side of this, my friend Dr. Ron Garbo talks about this. You write extensively about vagally mediated HRV and the vagal tank theory. And with this, we know that breathing is a huge part of measuring HRV, having that breath rate correct. I mean, the data is pretty clear on this, but it looks to me like breathing exercises fill the tank. Is that the way I should be interpreting this? And are we overemphasizing all the different breathing practices, or do you pick one and go?
Yeah, great question. I think breathing is very interesting because we know we can have a direct impact. And yeah, on the latter point, I would say maybe we overemphasize things like, there's many different protocols that are very similar, and, even finding your exact frequency at which you want to breathe, and then maybe breathe in and out at different ratios, or all sort of variations you can have, and holding, not holding. And of course, all of them have a slightly different impact. But in general, I think something as simple as 6 breaths per minute, even evenly split, 5 seconds in, 5 seconds out, or 4 seconds in, slightly longer exhale, because that's when the parasympathetic system there is more active. And then I think works well for maybe 99% of the people. And I think there's different components there. So you are breathing slowly, and that will impact your HRV acutely. But it's also what we cannot see sometimes linked to other practices where breathing is just one aspect of it. I'm thinking maybe meditation or mindfulness or all sort of things where you're stopping for X minutes and just breathing slowly, and trying in a way, like as a practice, I would say it's something that turns on the brakes, not only of your parasympathetic nervous system, but in general in a life that can be very busy and hectic. And I think there is something to that that can impact us positively in terms of the change in our physiology. I have to say, I think it's still a bit up for debate. What is the impact long term? So acutely, we can see that there is a large change as you practice. And I think it is also quite well established that it is good for us, meaning it can improve our sleep, can reduce our anxiety. It's like something that then subjectively we can perceive as positive also chronically over long periods of time. But it does not, I think, necessarily change our physiology, meaning that it's not that if we do this practice, we are certain that our HRV will improve over months of this practice, our resting HRV. So what we measure in the morning or in the night might not be eventually impacted much. I think it's important to say this because I think the practice is very helpful for all these things that we said earlier. Again, maybe reducing anxiety, improving sleep quality, and so on. And so we should not tie the practice to seeing changes in our resting physiology. Like if you do not see a change if you're resting HRV, you should not drop the practice thinking it's not useful. It might have so many other useful impacts on, your perceived stress level and all sorts of things, even though it does not maybe impact your resting physiology.
I really find it very interesting because we've had multiple people on the podcast before who do talk about how much vagal tone and nervous system regulation does have shown up in their HRV numbers in a positive way, whether it was an acute spike or it was a slower increase. But so it's interesting to see, and I mean, even Don, you have seen this with your use of vagus nerve stimulation, where you have seen an increase in your HRV, but I don't know if over time it eventually just kind of stabilized, so it doesn't like continue to raise the longer you do this practice.
Well,
I think it is
there's
certainly
just so
possible.
there's so many variables.
Sorry, just quickly. I think it is certainly possible that it happens. I just want to. So my point is that it does not necessarily happen. So that is the only thing that I think it's important for people to know is that the practice can still be useful even if that does not happen. And there will be people for which instead you certainly have also that response. I think it's important also to remember that, we are just individuals and there's a lot of individual variability. And, just like a training program can work very well for one and not for another, I think these kind of things also might show a bigger response in some people and a smaller in another one. And yeah, my point is mostly that even if you don't see that type of response, it can still be good for you.
And at an autonomic level, I think it's important to note, and we've talked about this many times, Klaudia and Marco. We talk about the role of trauma in someone's background and how it has caused them to adapt. We know there's a change in the amygdala. We know that there are some, the hyper focus that comes with trauma that has a dramatic impact on autonomic behavior. When that individual walks into my facility or walks, when we sit down to have a conversation, I don't know what they've been through, but it affects our ability to move some of these numbers. They have a new range. It establishes a new range for them. And you've got to take that into consideration.
I wanted to go a little bit deeper into that psychological stress and the aspect of brain health in HRV, because a lot of people who are familiar with your work, Marco, they see you play in the world of physical performance, optimization, peak performance. But I think in your book, you guys talk about the HRV's connection to cognitive function, to executive function, and even the prefrontal cortex. How did you get interested in that connection? Where did that come about?
Yes, actually, I have to say that here the real expert is my co-author, Emma Mosley. So what I know, I mostly learned from her. And so, actually, I can recommend that you guys have a session with her, all on cognitive health, which I think it can help, it can help a lot. Yeah, she's wonderful. And I think both her and Sylvain Laborde, they developed what they call the 3 Rs framework, which I think links well to the work that we did. So the 3 Rs would be resting, reactivity, and recovery. And resting will be what we talked about all this time. So it will be your morning HRV or your night HRV. And then reactivity is basically what happens when you face a stressor. And that is something that I think often is also misunderstood. That is basically the idea that because we stress the idea of stability, for example, of high HRV and so on, but then reactivity typically means that when you face a stressor, you should actually have a large change, maybe and a suppression in your HRV, which shows that basically your body is indeed reactive to the stressor. Because if you apply a stressor and nothing changes, then typically something is wrong because basically you're not responding to your environment and what is happening. And then, of course, after you had that change, you want to bounce back within a reasonable time, and that would be the recovery piece. And so they apply this framework to many aspects that are not training related, but more linked to psychological stressors and cognitive abilities and so on. And I think their research there is very interesting. But again, I would really, bring her in for this. Yeah.
That's really interesting. I love
So, so as let's get ready to wind things up here. We're running to the top of the hour, and we're going to roll into a little bit of a lightning round here, Marco. So as we start, tell us about what is your own daily HRV influence routine right now.
So normally I would measure my HRV in the morning. And as you know, I train a fair amount. I mean, I'm just a recreational athlete, but training is a big part of my life. So I use that data point mostly to understand how I am responding to the stress I'm applying from that point of view. Um, I've tried over the past 10, 15 years to make my life simpler, as I mentioned also earlier in terms of, my routines and so on. And I told you that my internet here is not great because I'm somewhere nice in the hills in Italy, but that also I think helps my stability of my HRV.
100%. Your
Yeah,
nervous system is
exactly.
probably happier.
It's certainly for sure more than when I'm in some chaotic cities. So all of these things, I think, long term have an impact. And then depending on what I do training wise, or if there are other stressors, I might also add maybe a routine that includes some slow breathing, a bit like all the work that Cyril Boards has done, where, what we mentioned also earlier, it could be simple 10 minutes as a frequency. Something that intrigues me is if that can be helpful also for athletes after higher intensity training to get back from an autonomic nervous system point of view, to their normal range, maybe quicker. And of course, there's other limiters to performance. You're still going to be sore, but maybe your nervous system can bounce back quicker and still allow you for greater capacity on the following days. So I experiment a bit with these kind of things. And I would say that's a bit it. I try to keep it rather simple. I take a snapshot and try to see how that reflects what I'm doing. And then if it is a higher stress day, I might add a routine that includes breathing, and so that's pretty much it.
So, Marco, 30 years ago, we were using a chest strap with a polar device. Smartphones really weren't here yet. We were just starting to play around with being able to measure HRV in real time, not in a lab. And then we got smartphones, and then we've evolved even more. Now we have some interesting wearable devices evolving, anywhere from wearable devices that are measuring EKG signals, but most of them are measuring blood flow signals. In a decade, what do you think we're going to be using to measure, and what do you see on the horizon that looks promising for someone who's been in this, not just from a physiological standpoint, but from a mechanical engineering standpoint?
Yeah. From an engineering point of view, I think what we have has really not evolved in a long time, right? So we have still accelerometers placed in beds, for example, right? That would be what you have in sleep, where another device that could measure these kind of things as you sleep. And we have the optical sensing that is everywhere in rings, watches, and bands, and the camera of the phone, like in our app, or There's attempts of using other cameras. It could be your computer camera, it could be your phone front camera, so that you don't have to actually use your hands for the measurement. But you could try to capture changes in blood flow on your face, in the skin, as opposed to your finger. Those kind of things, I think, are quite tricky and very noisy, because they have also been there for like 20 years. It's not new. Even though sometimes now they're a bit louder marketing wise, but still the technology has not shown to be particularly accurate, even though that kind of technology could add opportunities for measurements. I have to say that eventually, I think we add also challenges when we introduce these systems, because, for example, if we think about how important it is to measure these kind of things according to a good protocol, and we discussed that a bit earlier. Now, the more you capture data outside of those protocols and routines, and the more the data is irrelevant, I would say, because if you had coffee or you ate something or you were talking or you're not perfectly still or you're changing a bit your breathing, like really any sort of thing would change the measurement in a way that is just a number. It's not a representation of your capacity to assimilate additional stress on that day. It can only represent that if you measure it at a certain time, and that time is either the night or first thing in the morning while you stand still or sit and you're not really doing and thinking much else. So, we can place sensors anywhere and use different technologies and capture our physiology, but we might not necessarily gain, meaningful information, actionable information by doing that. So on my end, I'm a bit more of a less is more kind of person when it comes to this. But, I'm happy to be proven wrong and learn from others as well. So we will see what happens in the next decade.
Interesting. Seems like consistency is key no matter what you do.
For sure.
Now, what have you seen in your own life? I mean, you have it pretty much figured out, like what you do, when you do it, how you do it. But what have you seen in terms of having a biggest impact on your HRV over the years?
Yeah, it's definitely been a process. I don't know if I figured it out. It's better than it was for sure. So for me, the data really helped me see that indeed training was never the problem or the stressor for my physiology or my body or for my mental health. It was work. I've always been a bit of a workaholic, right? When I left Italy the first time, I went abroad and I had to somewhat prove myself, right? And everything was a new environment, a new language, and I was just a student, and so I just put myself into work, and it was a million hours every week. And then I went to the States, and the States is a place that if you already have that tendency, probably exactly. So it's not going to slow you down. And so I felt like a lot work stress and saw that a lot in the data. So harder periods of my life, I could see that, and that's how I tried to learn and to try to manipulate stressors a bit and learn to manage things and dedicate time to other aspects of life that are not just work. And I think slowly the data has reflected that as well. I mean, my HRV is higher now than it was 10, 12 years ago. And obviously I'm not any younger. So it's both changes, but I'm supposed to be seeing the opposite change after a decade. There is a meaningful the variation. It's not, we're not talking about last year. I've been measuring since I developed the technology. But then, again, it goes in the other direction. And of course, I exercise a lot more now than before as well. I eat better now. So it's many factors. It's impossible to tell which one, is having a larger impact, because of course, I'm not doing an experiment where for 2 years I sleep well, and then for 2 years I intentionally sleep poorly and eat well, and I cannot do those things, and just try to do all the right things and see what happens. And I think that has been insightful for sure in the data. And then periods in which maybe I focus a lot more on training, then that is what is reflected. And so I think the bigger stressors in our life tend to be reflected depending on what those are for you. And from that, we can learn a bit. Because again, with the idea of stability, then when we see drops, when we see multiple days in which we have drops, then maybe we can try to act upon those. And we need to remember there's always two ways to do that. It's not only removing stress, like with training, you reduce intensity, or in a way you remove a potential stressor, but there is also, trying to improve recovery. So you always have two avenues, right? If you cannot reduce stress, maybe you can still try, to get an extra nap, to go for a walk, or to eat better, like to do all sorts of things that even if your work stress cannot be reduced, you give your body, better capacity for recovery, basically, and to handle that additional stress. Yeah.
Interesting.
Well, Marco, I've got good news for you. I turned 64 in a month, but last year, I guess it's been a year and a half ago now, I was hitting the highest HRVs of my life. I had everything lined up, and so it can be maintained, it can be developed, but boy, it is not a simple equation. It is not a simple process. You have to pay attention to a lot of things. And the question is when does the stress of the worrying about it exceed the value that you're getting from the change in the behavior?
Yeah. I think that's something also for people to remember when we look at these kind of things. And maybe not every tool is for everyone, right? I think that is also important. Like if we are particularly anxious, or we know that it is more likely that looking at this data impacts us negatively, then maybe we are better off not looking at it, not having a wearable, not having an app that measures it. And, for sure, there's also those people. Again, we are not all the same, so we don't necessarily need the same tools.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, there's so much more to unpack, but we're going to have to wrap it up. But for our listeners, I do want to point out that you have a brilliant Substack. So how can people find out more about you, Marco, and your work and what you've written? Can you please share?
Thank you so much. So indeed, I think that's where I write the most. And I like to write, especially in long form. So you need to be a bit patient and dedicate some time to the reading. Sometimes like 30, 40 minutes long blog. But I really try to communicate what we learn and try to make it practical, and that's some case studies. So if you look up my name, Marco Altini, and Substack, you will find it. And I think that's where there is all my information, and also links to social and other platforms where I might be talking about these things.
Super good. Well,
Marco, it's truly an honor and a pleasure to have you on the podcast. I'm going to just drop a note here. We reserve the right to come back. We would like to do this more because this is a topic we are passionate about. Actually, Klaudia and I met through heart rate variability. And it's something that we're passionate about. So we want to reserve the right to come back to you again.
Yes.
I really appreciate
so
it.
Much more
Thank you so much. And it's been a pleasure. Yeah, for sure. And I love chatting with you. So I'm really grateful. Thank you.
Thank you. And for our listeners, be sure to send this to somebody who's been obsessing over HRV so they can finally get a peace of mind. And subscribe, comment, let us know if you have any additional questions and that we can answer any topics you want us to dive deeper into. And we're here for you. And thank you that you're here for us.
Marco, thank you. Klaudia, have a great day. And to our listeners, here's to that 1% gain. Please, Klaudia and I are working on a podcast that we're excited about coming up. And that's that challenge between, I'm going to use the term optimizing. It's improving. It's not obsessing. And
Yeah.
this is what is so important. So as we ask you to keep following us, because at the end of the day, it's about enjoying the days that we have here on Earth, and we hope you're getting the most out of it. So thanks for listening.
Thank you. And we'll see you next week.